How's that? Dr. We will hit.
Just checking in, is there a delay in the meeting?
Senator Anwar, are you able to hear us?
Yeah, no, I just heard you right now, but I couldn't hear earlier.
So are other members of the Zoom now able to hear us?
I can hear you now.
I can hear you now also. Yeah, I can hear
Yes,
now.
I hear you.
Before.
So actually, for those of you in the Zoom and able to use the reaction buttons, can you give a thumbs up on your reactions if you're able to hear? Wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, so it appears that we now have the ability to have those who are participating via Zoom hear what the conversation is in the hearing room. I would ask that during the course of the meeting, if you are on Zoom, and that would be members of the committee as well as the ACIR members, if you are having any issues with hearing, if you would please contact our committee clerk to let him know. And I believe we're okay. Speaker Sharkey, we are going back to you. If you could actually, before we do, now that those who are on Zoom are able to hear, and I know that both Representative Zullo and Senator Cassano are here and can hear, I would like to go back to them. We'll rewind a bit and offer both Senator Cassano and Rep. Zullo the opportunity to make any opening remarks before we go back to Speaker Sharkey. So again, thanks for your patience, and Senator Cassano, I will turn it over to you.
I'll be very short. Thanks. Good to see everybody. But the way this technology is working today, I'd rather get it before we lose it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Zullo.
Thank you for the indulgence this morning. Same sentiment, eager to hear from ACIR and thankful for the opportunity to see everybody this morning. So thank you and looking forward to today's presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Representative Zullo. So for those on Zoom, I'll just do a quick repeat. We are going to hear from Speaker Sharkey, who will turn it over to Attorney Mednick for the presentation and then have questions and conversation. Back to you, Mr. Sharkey.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Before we were interrupted, I was providing you, the committee, and the viewers a little bit of a summary of who ACIR is. I'm Brendan Sharkey. I was appointed by Governor Lamont as the chair of ACIR about a year and a half ago. And the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations is a statutory commission that is housed under OPM, and consists of representatives from the range of state and local interests, municipal authorities, regional authorities, the state government, OPM, legislators, and other members of the public who have been appointed by leaders within the state. Our mission is to facilitate a discussion and dialogue between state and local government in Connecticut and propose options and alternatives to the public and to the legislature that would facilitate better cooperation between state and local government and create more efficiencies, frankly, in how local government is provided to our residents. The commission has been in existence for almost 30 years now. So it has a long history of folks who've been very dedicated to this subject, and I'm pleased to have been appointed by the governor to take this on. The reason we're here today is just for informational purposes. And as I said at the opening, I want to congratulate you, Madam Chair, and Senator Cassano and the leaders, Senator Wong and Representative Zullo, and the other members of P&D for being the first committee to actually conduct this type of hybrid meeting. For me personally, it's fantastic to be back in the building, and good to see everyone in person. So this is I think, Madam Chair, you mentioned that ACIR has also been charged with evaluating the prospects of providing hybrid meetings like this at the local level and preparing a report with recommendations to the Planning and Development Committee as well as the GAE Committee before the session begins in February of 22. So this is also a learning experience for us as well as to how to actually make this happen. So thank you for that. The reason we're here this morning is because over the summer, it became apparent to members of the ACIR in following the dialogue on discussions of certain topics throughout the 2021 legislative session, that the term home rule has been invoked by folks on different sides of different issues and often is misappropriated. It suggests perhaps a misunderstanding of what home rule really means in our form of government here in Connecticut. And it was decided with the leadership of John Filchek, who is a member of ACIR and the executive director of NECOG in Northeastern Connecticut, that we perhaps take some time over the summer to investigate the question, get legal advice, get legal input to level set ourselves and the legislature on what home rule really means. With the hope, after we dive into a couple of particular examples over the course of a few months, to produce a short report for the committee members before the 2022 session to help provide a guideline and a framework for you all as you debate some of the critical issues that are happening that involve local government going forward. And I thought it appropriate, before I hand this off to our resident expert, Attorney Steve Mednick, who is considered one of the most experienced lawyers in municipal lawyers in Connecticut, particularly with regard to this topic and how they intersect with local charters and so on. He is going to provide to you a legal summary of what home rule means. And then, but before I get to that, and then we'll be open to questions from you all. Before I get to that, though, I was looking for an example of how, of what I'm talking about and what I think the committee, the commission is concerned about. And I came upon this example actually from 6 years ago on a topic that really has no bearing anymore on anything. It was there was an opinion piece in the Stamford Advocate written by a member of the local zoning commission, whose name I won't even reveal. It's not really important. But he was objecting to a bill that had been introduced by then Governor Malloy that would have established a special quasi-state agency dealing with the transportation corridor from Greenwich to Bridgeport. And this particular zoning commissioner in Stamford objected to the notion of this bill and said so publicly. And you know, the merits of this, I'll just say parenthetically, I was the speaker at the time, and I just checked on this before this morning's meeting. Actually, the bill made it to the House floor, but I never called it. So, so it never became a thing. But in reading the the opinion piece from this individual from Stanford, I think it kind of suggests what we're talking about and what our concerns were. And I'll just very briefly read a short excerpt of the opening of this opinion piece. It's called "A Connecticut Power Grab," which I think after Attorney Mednick's presentation, you'll see is a contradiction in terms. But the first paragraph reads, "Connecticut has a strong history and a rich tradition of home rule. An act proposed by Governor Daniel Malloy is a blatant challenge to the home rule doctrine. In this act, the state is attempting to take unto itself the land use controls conferred to the municipalities, which would be unconstitutional and in violation of Article 10 of the Connecticut Constitution." I don't need to read any more. I think you'll find from Attorney Mednick's presentation that that is a complete misstatement of the notion of home rule and the misapplication of the term to an issue that folks care about. And that's what we want to perhaps provide some guidance on. This usually comes up in the context of folks at the local level who object to something that's being proposed at the state level.
Well,
And
you're good. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks. Sorry.
And while that is, certainly appropriate for folks to object and to have policy differences, and the invocation of home rule as a reason to object to something is, I think, misapplied. So with that in mind, I'll turn it over to Attorney Mednick, who's joining us on Zoom, to provide his overview of the legal basis for what home rule is, what it is not, and perhaps then we can have some further conversation after he's completed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Attorney Mednick, before you begin, I just want to say again, welcome to those who continue, ACIR and committee members who are joining via Zoom, for members of the public who are watching and are not able to see. There are a number of members of the committee who are here with us via Zoom, and Attorney Mednick will be joining us via Zoom at this point as well. So I will turn it over to you, Attorney Mednick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's my pleasure. It's nice to see you twice in 1 week. I was down last week in Fairfield, the Charter Revision Commission. I'm glad to see you put your money where your mouth is about doing hybrid meetings, which the chair requested the Charter Commission in Fairfield to do. I'm also pleased to see Chairman Cassano, who I've known for so long. I don't even want to mention the number of years that I've known Senator Cassano, but it's a pleasure to be before him today. Vice Chair Gupil, who I worked with, came before one of my charter commissions and provided some really superb expert testimony on her experiences as a local government official. And I'm very pleased to also see the ranking members, Senator Huang and Representative Zullo. I'm honored to serve and speak before the committee today. Also pleased to be with Speaker Sharkey, and I thank him for his kind words and his leadership at ACIR. My good friend Lyle Ray and John Filchek, who have headed up COGS for many, many years and have done a lot of work in local government. And I'm also pleased to see Undersecretary Martin Heft here, who is a former local government official who I worked with for the last year and a half on a number of legal matters for the state of Connecticut. I almost don't have to say anything because the speaker really laid it out in very clear terms. And I would associate myself with his remarks, to use legislative parlance, because he really did state it. The point I try to make as I speak to people, and I've done a lot of charter work around the state of Connecticut, is I try to point out for the record that the term home rule seems self-evident on its face. You look at the words and it seems as if you know what the words mean. But what we have found over the years is it means different things to different people. Some believe that the words invoke a degree of local authority, local control, or even, and I will use the word sovereignty. We'll come back to that word in a few moments. But the term is not what it appears. It is really a misnomer rife with ambiguity and misunderstanding. And I think what the ACIR is trying to do, what the report of the ACIR is looking to, is to try to come up with a simple, direct, readable, and understanding definition of home rule, at least for purposes of debate in the legislature and at the local level. It's not an easy task, but if you want to build a foundation for thriving municipalities, and as we reach the quarter mark of the 21st century, we approach the quarter mark of the 21st century, that it's important to understand these two simple words and how these words have been misconstrued over the years. Connecticut's form of home rule, and I'm not going to get into a complete lecture on the difference between legislative home rule, which is what we have in Connecticut, and constitutional home rule, which they have in many other states, traces its roots to the mid-19th century, to a post-Civil War opinion from the Midwest. It's a rule called Dillon's Rule. And that rule holds that municipal corporations, and keep in mind that they are municipal corporations, can exercise only those powers that are explicitly granted to them. Important terms, explicitly granted to them, necessarily or fairly implied in or incident to those powers that have been expressly or explicitly granted, and that are essential to the declared objects and purposes of the corporation, not simply convenient, but indispensable. Over the years, Dillon's Rule was validated and nationalized by the United States Supreme Court in the first quarter of the 20th century. More recently, the Supreme Court in 1982, dealing with a tribal case from the West, indicated that, commented on the rule and the issue of local government authority by asserting that all sovereign authority in the United States resides with either the federal or state governments. There exists within the broad domain of sovereignty, but these two. It is critical to our understanding to point out that local governments are not sovereign. They are creatures of the state. They have been from the mid-19th century on. The Connecticut Constitution that was in existence through 1965 was silent on home rule. There was barely any mention of local government in that document. However, the notion of limited municipal authority was repeatedly addressed by courts in the 19th century and the early 20th century, clearly bringing into this, the state the concept of Dillon's Rule, which was based on legislative home rule. So up to and including the 1957 acts by the General Assembly, your predecessors made rules for local governments by enacting special acts. Local governments were created, their charters were created, not through a charter revision process, which the co-chair attended the other night, a public hearing process in a charter process. They were established by you, by the members of the General Assembly, and brought back to the local governments. In 1957, the General Assembly curtailed the special act regimen for local governments by adopting the Home Rule Act, which allowed municipalities to write, adopt, and is desired to amend its charter and to conduct municipal business within the scope of powers granted by the legislature. Those municipal powers are found mainly in Title VII of the general statutes, although there are additional explicit or express grants of authority in most of the titles of the general statutes. So those of us who are interested in home rule need to take a look at a much wider girth of the general statutes than Title VII alone. But again, this legislative framework confirmed the notion that local governments, that municipalities, are creations of the state or creatures of the state by affirming that municipalities have no inherent power to modify legislative acts or any inherent legislative authority whatsoever. What was the purpose of the Home Rule Act? If you look back at the legislative history, if you look at the Supreme Court decisions and other court decisions throughout the years, the purpose was to relieve the burden on you, on the General Assembly, of handling and enacting special legislation of local concern. That was one of the two purposes of the Home Rule Act, to relieve the burden on the General Assembly. At the same time, it also enabled municipalities principally to draft and adopt their home rule charter, which would constitute the organic law of the city, superseding the existing charter that was granted by the state and any inconsistent special acts. Again, I won't get into the details, but one of the things I always tell communities that still have special act provisions, don't eliminate them unless you want to eliminate the power that you have granted by those special acts. We can talk about that later if you'd like. So in 1965, what happened? In 1965, home rule was fully constitutionalized. Our form of home rule was fully constitutionalized with the adoption of Article 10 of the 1965 Charter. That section is entitled, quote, "of home rule," end quote. But when you read it, you'll realize what it says. It says that the Constitution says that the General Assembly, you, members of the House and the Senate, by general law, are now permitted to do what you had been doing since the 1957 Home Rule Act, and that is to delegate to municipalities such legislative authority as from time to time the General Assembly deems appropriate relative to the powers, organization, and forms of government or such political subdivision, principally focused on the form of government. It doesn't say anything about sovereignty. It doesn't grant sovereignty to local governments. It doesn't grant home rule authority to local governments. It grants to the General Assembly the ability to establish the forms of government so that local governments can operate under those forms. It also retains the ability to continue with special legislation. So the Constitution, Article 10 on home rule, still confers upon the General Assembly the ability to adopt special legislation and special acts. And so under the 1965 Constitution, which is often cited for some view of an organic home rule authority at the local level, is simply a constitutional grant of authority to the General Assembly to enable local governments to conduct their business under the constitutional structure that we have in Connecticut. So Connecticut home rule really is an artifice. It's a construct for the orderly operation of local government under the superior constitutional and legislative authority of the state. Connecticut local governments have no inherent rights, no inherent authority for local government, because the capacity for governance is derived entirely from the authority of the state. Another point I want to make, I was doing a charter revision in another community about a year ago, and they asked me the question about term limits at the local level. I argued the case on recall in the 1980s, Simons versus Canty, where the Supreme Court basically invalidated recall in the state of Connecticut, with the exception of 5 towns that have special act recall, and they have permitted recall in those communities, and used the same analysis the Supreme Court did, that there was no express grant of authority for the creation of term limits in local government for elected officials. And that, again, is consistent with our form of constitutional home rule, legislative home rule in the state of Connecticut. And one of the important points, so about a week after that meeting, and I gave that argument, one of my members came to me and said, well, Mr. Mednick, there's a town in Western Connecticut, happens to be a town in a council of governments that I represent, where they have term limits. And so I called the first selectman and their town attorney, and I asked them, and they confirmed that that was the case. And I said, what was the authority for it? And the town attorney said, well, I wasn't representing the commission. There is no authority for it. There is no special act. The chairman of the commission, who was a lawyer, said, well, it didn't say we couldn't do it. The law was silent and didn't say we couldn't do it. Now that is the form of home rule in a constitutional home rule state. If you're granted the general concept of home rule, you are assumed to have the authority that you need to operate in that construct. States like Michigan, other places that have constitutional home rule. The problem in constitutional home rule states is what the legislature ends up doing. Instead of giving you a positive, affirmative power, they come up with negative prohibitions on your power. So you have to kind of look at the negatives of what they have taken from you. And that is in some ways even more difficult than the express grant of authority. So the point I want to make is that the question for decision makers at the municipal level in Connecticut is not whether there is a statutory prohibition against an enactment, but whether there is a statutory authority for your local power, a statutory enactment that gives you the local authority. When it comes to the governance of municipalities, silence is not authority. There's also, again, Judge Dillon really came up with a great way to think about local government authority when he opined that state legislatures, the General Assembly in Connecticut, breathes into municipalities the breath of life, without which they cannot exist. As it so creates, so it may destroy. As I said to the ACIR, it sounds like it came from a Gothic novel from Mary Shelley, but the reality is that local governments are creations and creatures of the state. What are the various functions? What are the various things that local governments do, and how do the express grants of authority work? The most important thing, and the Supreme Court's the Constitution's pretty clear about this, is structure. What kind of government do you want? Do you want to have a mayor council, council manager form of government, a board of selectmen RTM form of government, a town meeting form of government? That is left to each of the governments in the state of Connecticut within the constructs that the state provides, and they're very specific, so you can't go outside of those constructs. You can have a board of directors form of government, like Senator Cassano's town, Manchester, the only board of directors form, I think, in the state of Connecticut. But they're specifically listed in the statutes, and you are confined to those choices for your structure. But that's probably the most expansive place where you have the ability to do something, creating your form of government, creating your charter. The functions, Title VII and other statutes impacts local government and how local government exercise their authority on functional issues of management, operations. Often there's an ambiguity as to whether a mayor or a town manager can act in a certain way. And again, if the grant of authority is not directly on point, and I'm a former corporation counsel, you need to, in New Haven, you need to take a look at whether the local official can construe that the function or power that they are exercising is necessarily or fairly implied or incident to the express grant of authority. That's come up in a number of different issues. We could talk about that later. There's fiscal responsibilities that local governments have. And if you take a look at Title VII, there's very broad authority on fiscal authority. But again, it's somewhat constricted. It's constricted. You have the ability to set up a budget, to establish tax rates. But there are a number of issues that you can stumble upon that address the governing for local governments of the borrowing of funds. There are state mandates, there are funded state mandates, there are unfunded state mandates that impact on the ability of a local government to survive on a fiscal level. The simple fact is the state sets the rules on what can be taxed and or collected. That's a major factor and a major constraint on the ability of local government to operate, but entirely consistent with the constitutional structure that we have in the state of Connecticut. Personnel is another area that we deal with every day in local government. There are issues of constricted authority there as well. And Title VII comes into play, MIRA comes into play in terms of the statutory structures set forth under MIRA, and collective bargaining comes into play in the way that local governments operate day to day. So the final point I want to make, again, and it's not to say that I think that local governments are entirely constrained. Municipalities under this structure have done some outstanding things, and I represent a lot of municipalities, small and large, and the COGs that work with municipalities have been very effective. Somewhat constrained, but but can be very effective under this form of government. But it's evident that you can have local control with limited authority, but you can have authority with limited control. It really depends on how you conduct yourself in the operations of your government. So the question for municipalities is how to look at Connecticut law, policy, and practice to permit more flexibility or latitude in the operation of local government within the structures of Dillon's rule, which is our constitutional standard in the state of Connecticut. So the issue is not whether something is violating home rule for the most part. The issue is whether there are state laws that are constricting the ability of local officials to act in one way or another. And those are legitimate battles. Those are legitimate issues to be fought out in the General Assembly, to be fought out between municipalities and the state government. But the concern I have when I listen to the debate is about the misconstruction of the concept of home rule. It's not home rule, it is the policy that you should be focusing on. And so I'm hoping that ACIR, in its work with you in the General Assembly, will come up with a definition that everybody understands so that we can actually debate the real issues for what they are. Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your time. I hope I didn't take too much of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Mednick. And am I correct in understanding that you do have a PowerPoint presentation that can be shared with members after this meeting and also posted to the committee's webpage? Is that correct?
I have a PowerPoint, and with permission of the chair, I also have a draft document that's a public document that I prepared for the ACIR. So I'd be happy to share them with the permission of Speaker Sharkey and the Vice Chair.
Absolutely.
That would be wonderful. I think so. Those documents are documents that were presented and shared with the ACIR previously, and I do think it would be appropriate to have those available directly to members of the committee. So thank you for that.
Happy to do so. Thank you.
Speaker Sharkey, is there follow-up before we
Yeah,
jump to questions and conversation?
Yeah, I didn't want to take any more of your time with presentation, but if you come back to the op-ed that I just referenced, after now that you've heard from Attorney Mednick about the limitations and the misapplication of the term home rule, you can see that this opinion writer in Stamford that I cited earlier, citing a state statute that would create a quasi-state agency as unconstitutional because it usurps home rule. Obviously, that would not be an accurate application of the term home rule. I was also trying to think of other examples of how that raise the questions about what can a municipality do or not do. And I know Attorney Mednick and I spoke about an experience that some of you may be familiar with in New Haven. They had a very controversial proposal in New Haven to issue identification cards to all residents, regardless of immigration status or without asking that question. You can debate the policy behind that and whether you support that or not as to why they're doing that. But I think Attorney Mednick and I both sort of scratched our heads in retrospect saying, and I think he at the time, although he wasn't working for the city at the time, what is the expressed authority that would grant the city of New Haven the ability to do that? Under what statutory authorization could New Haven issue IDs of that type? It's an open question. I'm not sure it's been answered fully, to be honest. But that's another example, though, of how home rule, depending upon the issue and depending upon the philosophy of the individual, can be misapplied, can be asserted as a reason and as a basis for why you can do this, when in fact, you really can't. And unless there's an express authority granted to the municipality that enables the municipality to take that action. So that's the context in which we wanted to make this presentation to you and then have a report for you before the session starts in 22. So with that, we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For those of you on Zoom, I would ask that you please, as we did during our committee process last year, use the raise hand function. And I will start with folks here, although, and I have a couple questions, but I'll hold those till the end because others may get to them as well. But I will start with our ranking member, Senator Wong.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Sharkey, and I'm going to call you my speaker as well. And Mr. Mednick, thank you very much. It's very insightful, and the concept, the legal concept of home rule is very well explained by you. One of the important parts is, in my experience, we talked earlier, Speaker, your leadership as Speaker and the initiation of the Moore Commission, the what they call it, municipal opportunities and regional efficiencies, to look at regionalization and the shared cost concept. I was very intrigued by that. In fact, just past legislative session, the governor included part of that package in regards to shared costs among our municipalities. I applaud that. I think efficiencies and things of that sort are important to reduce burden on our municipalities, particularly local property tax impact on our residents in each municipality. And I see all the rationale. And even as we looked at this, it's really important to apply your interpretation to Connecticut. It is important for people to understand that, as you cited in 1957, that we established the legislative intent of home rule that's been referred to. And it is also very important to understand in its aftermath, the Connecticut General Assembly and the democratically controlled legislature voted to remove county government in the state of Connecticut in 1960. That was a precursor to kind of understanding that Connecticut is not the Midwest via the Dillon Rule, that we as a state in a legislative vote made the decision to move away from county government / government structure and regionalization to local home rule. That's why that history line is really important. And I think as you prepare that presentation to the broader audience, you need to explain that in light of 57, in 59, the state of Connecticut made the decision to move away from existing county government. That being said, I think it's equally important to understand that the history of this state has an impact in regards to the concept of home rule. We have very strong representative town meetings. In fact, one of the towns I represent in Easton actually has a town meeting to determine budget votes and issues in person. I know it comes very difficult when we look at larger municipalities, but this state was founded on the concept of regional town governance, local control, and home rule. Now, I understand that we have increased complexities, increased challenge, and particularly in this day and age of COVID, with federal money flowing in, the allocation of it, and again, trying to streamline efficiencies, that we have to find a balancing act. But the strict interpretation of a legal manner when you're applying in the context of many states in this country of county government, where home rule as a concept is defaulted to a county-wide regionalization, is a challenge that we need to note when applied to the state of Connecticut. So I'm eager to hear more about that. And as I said earlier in my opening remark, that I hope that more local municipalities from big cities to suburbs, as well as our rural communities, and have their local leaders be able to opine and offer their perspective and their interpretation of home rule. Not simply a legal interpretation based upon a broader. Connecticut is unique. There are things that we can learn in efficiencies, but when you look at the concept of home rule, it is not just steeped in legal interpretation. It is steeped in the history of how our towns have been formed, governed, and engaged in having impact. There is a collaboration with our state and local governance. And if there's anything of a proof of that to me as I study the history of it, is we removed county government. And per your recommendation and statement, that we actually implement a statutory interpretation of home rule. It may be different to the Dillon rule in other states, but Connecticut's unique. And I hope, as I mentioned to Speaker Sharkey, my first exchange with him literally almost 8-9 years ago, it is an important conversation that existed back then. It will be a continual dialogue moving forward, but we have to make policy in the context of the unique aspect of Connecticut and its local municipalities. Is 169 towns totally efficient? Perhaps not, perhaps yes, but ultimately it offers a point of conversation. And we do have that statutory interpretation of home rule, not applied from other states, but applied to Connecticut. So I'm eager and I'm honored to be a member on the Planning and Development Committee. I'm equally honored to be engaged in this conversation where we can find a balancing act. But let's not forget our history. Let's not forget how our towns and our local governance have a say in representing the people. At the same time, I think as we learn in this COVID environment, we all have to work together. But the basis of control, the basis of ultimate decision-making, I'm a believer that local knows their community best. And the state one-size-fits-all does not always provide the best equitable and best sustainable solution moving forward. So I thank you for that opportunity, but I wanted to offer that context that I hope as your organization engage in further communications and further conduct, that you broaden the base, but also account for the historical context of local governance in relative to home rule and the history of how it occurred in Connecticut. Connecticut is not Iowa. It is not Mississippi. It is not even New York. But at the same time, we can learn from the best of the best, but we can also learn to retain what is best for Connecticut and the local municipalities' ability to manage their own destiny. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. That's him over there. I'll stick with chair here. Thank you, Senator Wong. And I believe Attorney Mednick may have some comments, and I'll start with Mr. Sharkey and then go to Attorney Mednick.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that, Senator. And I think I appreciate you mentioning the Moore Commission, for example. One of the things that the Moore Commission, in looking for regional efficiencies, the first thing that the Moore Commission had to do was identify all the statutory restrictions that had over the years been imposed on municipalities that prevented them from seeking the regional efficiencies that we might otherwise like. Why is that? Because here in Connecticut, under our Constitution and our statutory structure, under a Dillon's rule state, towns can only do what the state authorizes them to do. So therefore, if the state of Connecticut has not expressly granted a town the ability to share police departments with a neighboring police department, there needs to be a statutory authorization to do just that. It's not that a town can unilaterally decide that they can take that action. You mentioned Easton as a great example of how their local government creates budgets and how that is a choice that to their credit, that the residents of Easton employ, but it's only because state statute allows them to do that. It's not again, I'll use the example that I was raising before. If a city like New Haven decides it wants to issue ID cards for all residents that have other legal implications, can they do that? Well, I don't know. I don't know, because I don't know if the state has expressly authorized any municipality to do something like that. So it's not necessarily just a legal construct that in the abstract. This is the law of the state of Connecticut. And if the state wished to move to a true home rule context, like Attorney Mednick mentioned in Michigan and in other Midwestern states, then we would need to amend our Constitution and the statutory framework beyond that. So that's the only pushback I might offer. This is it is the way we do things in Connecticut, and we grant a lot of authority to towns, but it's not unlimited and it's not sovereign. So, and I don't know if Attorney Mednick had any thoughts as well.
Again, you stole my thunder, Mr. Speaker, but the point I want to make to the distinguished ranking member is that the adoption of Article 10 came after the elimination of counties. The counties were removed in the late 1950s. The Constitution was amended in the mid 1960s. And so the concept of local sovereignty, which was not addressed by Article 10, cannot be implied because we would like to see it implied. Just about my entire legal practice, particularly in the last 10 years, has really moved closer and closer to just representing local governments. There's nobody, well, I'm sure there's many of you and there's many local officials, so I'll stand with all of you who care deeply about the operation of local government. I love working with local governments. I love working with the Council on Small Towns, with CCM, all the entities that work on establishing rights for local governments and have tried over the years to do that. But it's within the context that the speaker clearly enunciated, and that is the context of Dillon's rule. And again, to change that, you have to change the state constitution. But to go back to a point that I made earlier, be careful what you wish for, because even in those states where they have what they call constitutional home rule, there are traps that local governments can fall into when you think you've got authority, but then the General Assembly, the legislature has prohibited that authority, or it's hidden in a bill. You just don't know that it's out there. You're so much better off in some ways knowing what the express grants of authority are than having to walk through a minefield in the states that don't have legislative home rule. Last point I want to make, and again, the speaker talked about this. One of the things I do in just about every charter I've advised throughout the state of Connecticut is to develop interlocal cooperation, whether you call it regionalism or interlocalism. I try in those charters to make sure that even if the government says you need to have a department, if you enter into an interlocal compact, which would be, again, governed by state law, by a state enabling legislation, you would have the ability to do so long as the service that is mandated by your charter is being met by the region, being met by the compact that you have with another local government. So I try to write charters to make sure they don't constrict the operation of a local government, but they give the local government the ability to expand as much as they can. So I do believe in an expansive view of local authority, but it's constrained by our state constitution and by the laws enacted by the General Assembly.
Thank you, Attorney Mednick. Anything further, Senator Long, that you want to add to that? And with us, we have another member of our ACIR, and if you could introduce yourself for those listening, we're grateful to have you with us, Mr. Filczak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is John Filczak. I'm a member of ACIR, and I'm the Executive Director of the Northeastern Connecticut Council of Governments. And I guess I'm going to be the primary author of the finished paper for ACIR. And one of the things I just wanted to share in line with the discussion we just had is I'm looking at some research from Harvard that is actually suggesting that the home rule authority should be liberalized to promote more innovation and options for communities, rather than go more restrictive, to go the other way, which is it's an interesting discussion and argument there that for instance, if you look at the land use statutes at 8-2, compared to most states, is a fairly restrictive body of statute. So, when we look at property tax reform and other areas, large policy issues, I think the home rule limitations is something we want to also comment on. Specifically, we're going to look at land use, education, and finance in this report. So I just wanted to mention that. I don't have any conclusion I'm just researching that research, if you will, right now. And I'd also just have to add, I mean, Connecticut really never had functioning counties in the way that, as someone who lived in a state with very strong counties out in the West, really they served almost no purpose, other, very limited. So their elimination was not as dramatic as it would be, say, in a New York or an Iowa or Montana. So historically, I think that's, we don't have much of a history with counties. It's towns.
Thank you, Mr. Filczek. Senator Wong.
Thank you, Mr. Filczek, and I appreciate that finishing point that Connecticut has been about towns. But as I move on, thank you for all your feedback. It really is helpful to have this conversation because as I learned when you were speaker, Mr. Sharkey, the Moores Commission contributed mightily to the discussion, and I thank you for that. But ultimately, there's so many interrelated parts. When you come into money, when you come into services, we all have to kind of understand there is an interconnectedness and that we are interdependent upon each other. And so none of it is exclusive, either total state control or total municipal local control. There is a interweaving. That being said, I think also during your tenure, I learned about the idea of unfunded mandates to our municipality. The idea of one size fits all, or even mandates that we in the legislative body under the Gold Dome, when we were meeting in person, made decisions that imposed on every one of the towns. And that has always been the bane of most of our municipal leaders is, why am I being compared to XYZ town when my challenges are uniquely different? So that is the challenge. And maybe, just maybe a point of clarification is maybe a wake-up call for many of our local leaders that believe that they have the concept of home rule, when in reality, under the statute and the current interpretation of this legislature, is there's no such thing. That the state has the prerogative and empowers your municipality to make decisions. That is an important differential and clarification because many of our municipal leaders believe that there is a balance of power, a separation. If that does not exist in statute and interpretation, then it is a clear wake-up call for many of our legislators. And Mr. Pilczek mentioned 8-2. We did make a change in House Bill 6107 last year. I'm embarrassed to say I remember it so well, but it was a topic of conversation. As much as it had been collaborated and softened, it codified in my mind that the state maintains the prerogative under 8-2 of zoning powers. And that is important as we begin this conversation moving forward in this legislative body and further down the line is, if municipalities and local governing board says no, they should voice it. They should have their voices be heard in dialogue and conversation, not a unclear interpretation that when laws come down, all of a sudden they're being told what to do, as we've learned by the consternation of 8-30G of a state empowerment policy. 8-2 changes in regards to some of the regulations that we impose on local planning, zoning, and housing authorities. It really is an important conversation that needs to incorporate all shareholders. So I appreciate this conversation, but I also want to close with Mr. Pilczek's comment that county government didn't work in Connecticut because it had always been town-based. And if we can learn from how Connecticut thrived from a regional government to a town-based birth, then perhaps we can take the best of all of it and create a sustainable and viable political and economic ecosystem to thrive and succeed. COGS may be a good compromise, but we see that mired in differences in our municipalities and in collaborating, working together with their priorities. So again, I want to thank the chair for this conversation. I want to thank ACIR for their engagement, but I hope that as we begin this conversation more, the language is clear. What I'm hearing right now is the statutory interpretation right now is there is no such thing as local home rule, that the state has a prerogative and its discretion to empower your local municipalities and all bodies to do your business on a local community. So that's clear. I want to make sure that that's clear in the general conversation and to the general public, and let the public react and offer their perspective as well. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Wong. Are there members on Zoom who have questions for our presenters today? Representative Zullo.
I'm out of practice. I'm putting up my thumb when I should be putting up my hand. Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Speaker Sharkey and Attorney Mendick for your very detailed presentation. I actually don't have any questions, and I don't really have much of a reason to disagree with your legal analysis. I've generally always understood your analysis to be the lay of the land when it comes to the legal concept of home rule. My issue, and it's almost a political issue that you run into sometimes, the example I always give is the state funds something, right? And they fund it for a long time. And then all of a sudden, they decide that there's no more money for it, and they take that funding away. And you have a town that comes back to the state and they say, hey, we're entitled to this. This is our right. We need this. And the state says, well, no, we were just always doing it. We were always just being benevolent. It wasn't really your right. When it tends to a lot of times work an injustice on local towns because they become dependent on that. They become used to it. And I've always approached it, particularly in the concept or in the realm of zoning, from the same perspective that towns for so long have been used to handling their own affairs and having, although our zoning statute our enabling act is rather restrictive, having what at least towns understand to be, some local control, some we'll call it home rule when it comes to zoning in that regard. So I think that the recent policy shift as far as changing some of those zoning regulations has come as a shock to some municipalities. And in some towns, people feel like it's working an injustice on them. So I do agree with you that it's a policy issue. It's something that needs to be debated on the floor. But I like to think of it separated. There's the legal concept of home rule, which you discussed, in depth, and again, which I thank you for. And then there's that equitable concept of home rule, local control, that towns are saying, no, we want to handle our own affairs. We've done it for so long. We feel like we do a good job. And these new ideas, this new framework is going to work an injustice by taking away a framework that we've been operating in for so long. So I want to add that as a fresh perspective. And I just want to thank you for your thorough analysis and your time.
Thank you, Representative Zullo. Are there others among the committee who are on Zoom or in person who would like to ask any questions or comment? And I see Mr. Ray, I will come to you in just a moment because I have a couple of questions for Attorney Mednick myself and a couple of comments as well. But Mr. Mednick, and I see you on the Zoom. For some reason, I see Rep. Zullo on the screen. So you're on our big screen right now. Attorney Mednick, you were talking earlier about the special act. And as you walked through, and I think it will be great to have that PowerPoint afterwards. I know that's an old teacher's trick to give the PowerPoint after the presentation was done. But the 1957 Home Rule Act, special acts, we still have them today. Can you talk a little bit more about special acts today, what they mean, how those interact with what we have in terms of our regular public acts and what was changed in the Constitution in 1965?
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's a really good and important question to ask. When I tackle a charter revision in various communities, and I'm just beginning to tackle the one in Fairfield, one of the things I tried to take a look at is to see whether there's any unique powers or authority that you have in your charter that you cannot find in Title VII. I can't tell you what they are in Fairfield, if they exist at all, because we've just started the process. But I'll give you a few examples of special act provisions that remain in place to this day. There are 5 communities in the state of Connecticut that have recall. Why? Because those provisions were included in their charter so that you can recall officials in 5 communities that have special act recall. The communities that do not have recall authority. As of the early part of the century, the city of New Britain had the authority to go into the town of Cromwell and engage in eminent domain pertaining to the reservoir that was owned by the city of New Britain in Cromwell, and could go into Cromwell regardless of the state statute and exercise its authority to take land in another town to preserve and protect their reservoir. That's another example of a special act that has remained in place in a community. Waterbury has, they have water police that can police Bantam Lake. So don't be surprised if you own a cottage on Bantam Lake, that somebody in a Waterbury water police outfit, I'm not sure they truly exist, but they have authority to regulate and to control things that go on in Bantam Lake, many miles away from the city of Waterbury. So those are ancient special acts that remain in place in some of those communities. New Haven has zoning, has a special act zoning that remains in its charter, regardless of Title VIII. They have special act zoning that remains in place in Connecticut, in the New Haven Charter. So those are some examples of historic special acts. You still do some special legislation from time to time for municipalities. If there's a unique issue that is involved. You also do circumvention. There are legislation that has been written that I've seen over the years, and I won't name any of the pieces in particular, that have been written for particular municipalities without mentioning the municipality, but it says that a municipality in South Central Connecticut with a population of X would qualify for this particular benefit. You're circumventing, you're basically doing special legislation without doing it. So you still have that ability, and under Article 10, you clearly have that ability to continue to do special legislation. But for the most part, the legislature has given up on creating special legislation for the form of government and rather uses it to deal or address a specific problem that a local government may be having from time to time. So those are some examples of how special legislation, special acts have worked and remain in effect throughout the state of Connecticut.
Thank you for that, Attorney Mednick. So put another way, a special act would be something that really applies very specifically and is not a blanket to apply to every municipality. And it's something that we do still do, in fact, very much so within this committee, and address those very local and specific municipal issues. But to your point, the 1957 Home Rule Act was in part to relieve the burden on the General Assembly so that we were not needing to do those things for each individual community, so that the communities would be able to do those things for themselves. So,
and the 1965 Constitution confirmed that authority.
Yes. So in other words, we have that ability continues in the context of the home rule construct that we have within the Constitution.
Yes.
So we do still have that as a legislature.
Correct. Absolutely.
I think that's something that is not often understood here in the building when we are doing some of those special acts and the difference there. So I appreciate you taking the time to answer that and make that a little bit more clear for all of us, myself included. When I listen to what your presentation is, I'm thinking about a comment that was made at the ACIR meeting, and it was, well, you're an attorney who is clearly a very respected and experienced voice on this matter, and I appreciate your mention of Fairfield, and I certainly will be seeing and hearing more from you locally. But there was a comment or question about, well, are there other voices and other interpretations? And I wondered if you could speak to that here. You know, are there other attorneys in the state who you've had this conversation with who might have a difference of interpretation. Representative Zullo, as he made his remarks, sounded as if he was in concurrence with your legal analysis. Those were his words. And certainly Rep. Zullo, correct me if I'm misstating that. But are there others who might have a difference of opinion?
You know, most of the municipal lawyers I know that I've worked with at CCM, that I worked with during the pandemic on the executive orders and the local government executive orders, bipartisan people from across different political ideologies and political parties. Really, this is not rocket science. This is a fairly clear area of the law. Now, I will tell you, and he's not here to defend himself, and I don't see Senator Cassano's not here, it's his old friend, Joel Kogan, and I, from CCM, Joel Kogan was the founding director of the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities. Joel believed in a very expansive power for local governments. Joel was a lawyer, but it was never rooted in law from my perspective. Even when I was a younger lawyer, when I used to fight with Joel about this, when I went to Simons versus Canty of the state of Connecticut, he was appalled that I was taking the position on the express grant of authority, but it was the consistent position. So I'm sure there's got to be a lawyer out there somewhere, Madam Chair. I just haven't met that lawyer at this point, and they're not active in practicing with cities and towns in the state of Connecticut. Somebody may be out there. I'm more than happy to call around and see if I could find somebody for you, but I'm just not aware of that person.
Thank you for that. And I do appreciate that this is an ongoing conversation at ACIR, as Mr. Filczek said. I certainly would be interested in taking a look at that Harvard research that you were referencing. This is a very worthy conversation. You know, our systems of government, and certainly, as has been referenced a number of times, locally we are having that conversation, and communities all around our state do. And we here at Planning and Development are grateful to be able to have that conversation together with your input from ACIR, which includes municipal leaders, which includes labor leaders, which includes education leaders, which includes attorneys and executive branch members, and I think is a very representative group, which I'm grateful for Senator Cassano for his ongoing leadership and support of that forum and that model for us to be able to have these kinds of conversations. I think today you have very clearly put before us what is the legal construct. And I think Rep. Zullo put a finer point on some of the differences between the political constructs and the legal constructs. When we write bills, when we pass laws here, it is based in that legal construct. It is based in what our Constitution and our statutes say. But those are part of the conversations. Of course, we are a political body, so we always strive to come to the best balance between what is done locally, and certainly, as having served as a local leader myself, I too value very much our communities, the input of our communities, and also understand that while some people may frame our state laws as one size fits all, as we've talked about here today and at other points in time, that is by definition what state law is. It's a law that applies to all of us, though we did talk today about the difference in terms of special acts, which are just that. But otherwise, our public acts apply throughout the state. And sometimes perspective is an important thing. And so we want to listen to those various perspectives. Federal, state, and local are all important to how we move forward and look to our future as a civilized society and a democracy. I think those things are so important, that sense of balance. I don't see any other members' hands, so I am going to turn it over to Mr. Ray, who I believe is the vice chair of the ACIR. Welcome, Mr. Ray.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank Speaker Sharkey and Attorney Mednick for their work on this home rule issue. I just wanted to add a couple of tidbits here. I've been teaching public administration for not a long time, and there are three competing principles underlying our conversation today. that are a little different. The first principle is called subsidiarity, which is you decentralize or delegate to the lowest effective level of government. A good example of this, when I was doing some consulting work in Thailand, the Minister of the Interior approved every traffic light in the country in Bangkok, and they drowned in a whole bunch of minute issues. And again, the strength of the United States is we've had a subsidiary principle where delegation and decentralization has been right from day one, which is a very important first principle. The second one is a little competition for it, and that's the economies of scale and critical mass around an issue, which is a competing principle. So we have hundreds of 911 call centers. It's not entirely clear that's the right size because of economies of scale or critical mass, but that's a competing principle. So efficiency is a competing principle, and that is the principle of economies of scale. And the final one, only a public administrator could love, is called the correspondence theory of governance, which is that the scope, the geographic scope of an issue should correspond to the geographic scope of the governance response. So a good example of this in Connecticut is we've spent a huge amount of money in the state cleaning up the Connecticut River, and then upstream is an independent set of actors that may or may not be cleaning up the river. So the correspondence theory, you sort of need to get everybody in a tent that's related to an issue. So I think what you've heard today on home rule, I think it's an important concept, but there are underlying principles of government design, of subsidiarity, economies of scale, and correspondence that drive that. And I would suggest, and this is the point that John Filchak was making about the Harvard study, there's more that we can do to delegate to local governments, frankly. We have a very centralized state government in a number of aspects. I can give you examples. The Department of Transportation is very centralized. They could delegate a lot more to regions and towns. So there's actually a lot of movement here. So those three principles of subsidiary, economies of scales, and correspondence are actually dynamic. They're not carved in stone. They change with the issues, they change with the times, they change with people's preferences. So I just wanted to add that kind of 30,000-foot overview to the conversation on home rule and the work of ACIR. We're working on the local government of the future in ACIR, and Chair Sharkey is leading us on that. And that's the whole issue of effective, efficient, and responsive local government services. But those three principles, I think, are an additional element of an overlay of what we're talking about today. So it's not just the very specific elements of home rule, but subsidiarity, economies of scale, and correspondence on issues. So that's just a comment, and I wanted to thank the committee for having this hearing today, and I want to thank the chair of ACIR and thank Attorney Mednick for all of his work, and John Filchak.
Thank you, Professor Ray. We appreciate that. And it's a helpful frame. I do see that Representative Dubitsky has his hand raised. Representative Dubitsky.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We very often are involved in creating legislation that sweeps a broad brush over all the municipalities. And one thing that as legislators we really need to recognize is the extreme differences between municipalities. Downtown Hartford and downtown Bridgeport are very, very different communities with different social and demographic and geographic and logistical issues than towns like Union with 800 residents, or Scotland, which is a town I represent, with 1,700 residents in a geographic area approximately the size of the city of Hartford. So we very often look at problems in a way that that really focuses on the cities, and the effects of those policies on small towns is sort of, excuse me, is sort of brushed off as collateral damage. And when we're talking about home rule, I think it's important to make sure that each municipality has the opportunity to make rules and make policies that are appropriate for it and its the way that the form of government it has, the geography, the the location, the number of people, etc. So when we're talking about defining home rule, it's important to interpret those statutes in our Constitution as much as possible in a way that gives each municipality, which are very, very unique, the ability to act in its best interest. Because there are policies that some of the bigger towns can easily sustain, requirements that we impose on the municipalities that a town that has a full-time staff, towns that have a government with departments and things like that can pretty easily handle, which a town that with with 2 or 3 people working in town hall and staff that works 1 or 2 days a week simply cannot swallow. And we have to remember that in each time we're talking about home rule and our interpretations of the home rule statutes, that the term home rule and the concept of home rule is there for a reason. And it's not just because to make it easier for the legislature to take some of the burden off of us. It's also to give these very, very diverse municipalities the opportunity to craft and mold their own policies to fit the people of their towns. And I just hope that we don't lose that that idea when we're talking about home rule and when we hear that the state really has most of the power. Well, perhaps it does, but we need to be very cognizant that that a town with or a city with hundreds of thousands of people really needs to have a very different set of rules and policies than a town that has 800 people. That was my only comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Dubitsky. And indeed, you're referencing something that Attorney Mednick spoke to when he talked about that 1957 Home Rule Act, those two things: one, to both relieve the burden on the General Assembly, but two, to allow municipalities to enact their own charters. And I think, those are both important things. And I do think that what Mr. Ray expressed to us in terms of that 30,000-foot view is very important. The idea of subsidiarity that, for example, in the Transportation Committee this year, we have allowed municipalities to designate pedestrian safety zones because the pedestrians who use those zones are the people who live in those communities. And that's an example of where we, want to make sure that those decisions get made very locally. And then that, as he said, that competing or corresponding piece of economies of scale and looking together. Certainly, I was back to my home state of Pennsylvania recently, which does have very strong county government system. And the county where I grew up, Chester County, Pennsylvania, is also within that county itself, not even the state, extremely diverse communities. Absolutely, cities with extreme poverty and very, very small boroughs as well. So these challenges and conversations are ones that are faced throughout the nation, and I think are worthy conversations. So I appreciate your comments. Thank you, Representative Dubitsky. Are there other members? And I am seeing none. And seeing none here in the room. Speaker Sharkey, one last word before we adjourn.
Yes, I don't want to hold us, but I just wanted to remind the committee that the ACIR stands for the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. So everything that we've been talking about today with regard to the interplay of home rule and local control, two different concepts with two different meanings, we're trying to take that on within ACIR. And in particular, we have a separate initiative called that our Vice Chair, Mr. Ray, referred to, which is the Local Government of the Future. And since the pandemic, we've taken it on as a mission to reimagine local government as a government of the future, to make it more efficient, to make it more responsive to the needs of local government in relation to what the state might otherwise ask our towns and cities to do. So we're looking forward to completing the report that the legislature has required of us in terms of the hybrid meeting analysis. That's clearly a local government of the future issue for sure, as is this. So we welcome the continued dialogue with the P&D committee, of which I used to be a chairman in your spot, and so it's warm. It's a warm place for me. It's near and dear to my heart, and I'm looking forward to our continued collaboration with the committee. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Speaker Sharkey, and we are glad that you are having those conversations. As we know, here within the committee, we will be continuing to address these issues, certainly here in the building and every local community, in terms of specifically with respect to how we meet together and come together as we move forward. I think that's really important. I will also add something I mentioned at the beginning. Senator Pisano serves as an appointed member of the ACIR, though I know I have been welcomed at the meetings, and I would suggest to any member of our committee that those meetings are open and available to us, and would encourage you to participate and follow along, as there are some, I think, important conversations happening there. Seeing no further comments, questions, and discussions, I will again thank the ACIR and thank you, Attorney Mednick, for your time with us today. And with that, we are adjourned.